Still says, "G'day, Jeff." G'day, Mr. Sold, I should say.
I was actually thinking of wearing a mask, like the Viva Vendetta thing. And I thought, no, that's going to be a bit far. But so at the moment, you're working with Europeana Glam Wiki. What are you doing with it?
It's basically the kind of job that the glam. It's the personification of the Glam Wiki sector. Would you say? I'm working for Europeana, which is the sister organization to Trove in Europe. I live in Italy, and it's based in the Netherlands. And it's my role is to try and connect through Europeana, Europe's museums and libraries and collections to Wikipedia and vice versa. Europeana doesn't own those collections or those institutions, but it's a fantastic vehicle or connecting organization between the stuff and the people. Not the only one, but it's amazingly useful.
So have you got lots of people like working, like, you know, do you have to kind of get a group of people together to actually focus attention on a particular subject or a particular museum, or how do you do that?
It depends on the nature of the interest of the individual and of Europeana and of the Wikimedia chapters around the continent and also of the museums themselves. Any one of those might have a particular focus or a particular activity or a campaign going on to promote or raise awareness for a particular thing. It's about jumping on board with that and trying to help it become as visible as possible. It's also a factor of the quality of the content those institutions put out. If there's a museum that is all of a sudden sharing high-quality files with high-quality metadata onto Europeana, then that makes it that much easier to and much more interesting for the community writ large to reuse it.
And there's a lot of support for this from people in the wiki world to kind of want to put this material into Wikipedia.
Yeah. The question is actually the reverse of what it was a few years ago. When I started Glam Wiki in 2009 with the inaugural conference in Canberra, the question was much more of ambivalence or overcoming ambivalence, overcoming fear and mistrust. Now we have the reverse problem that there are too many museums sharing too much stuff for us to be able to handle as volunteers. So there's much more a sense of institutions trying to one-up each other to become more interesting to a global volunteer audience, a global digital crowdsourcing audience. If you're going to spend your time on X rather than Y, then you'll have to have a good reason. So the shoe's on the other foot now. It's no longer Wikipedians knocking on the doors of museums saying, please, can we have your JPEGs? Now the museums are saying, please, can you use our TIFFs?
Well, I suppose that leads me into kind of one of the questions for the upcoming conference. And, this is, who will the staff of these future museums be? I mean, clearly, you could see that there would be, rather than having to rely on volunteers, do you think there's staff that should be employed specifically to work with Wikipedia for all museum content, that they shouldn't be kind of like just relying on a volunteer group out there? Or how do you think that, or isn't Wiki really set up to do that? Well, I know there was problems before about paid staff and things like that, wasn't there?
It certainly can be controversial to pay someone to promote your organization, and that's the case for commercial organizations. When you're talking about cultural organizations, the logic is quite different. But moreover, it's the nature of any kind of volunteering, and volunteering in museums is different in different countries. In Sweden, for example, it's quite unheard of or quite controversial, and in Australia it's quite normal and standard and expected. But my opinion on volunteering is if you need something to be done, if it's a requirement for it to be done, then you have to professionalize it. It's not a nice added extra. And equally, volunteering or having a volunteer program is not a free source of labour. It's something that requires an investment rather than merely an outsourcing to people who don't need to be paid. It's quite possibly cheaper for some organisations to employ guides, for example, rather than to have volunteer teams which require their own training and support in different ways. Volunteering should be seen as community building in a much more active and associated with the institution kind of way, rather than just outsourcing the stuff that we don't want to pay for.
So do you find, I mean, I remember that there was a meeting, I remember when I first met you, there was a meeting at the Powerhouse and we all sat around a table. People ran off to kind of enter stuff at the wiki as we were talking about different aspects of the Powerhouse Museum. And it did seem that the expertise that you acquire about particular objects would lend. I remember thinking that if I was to enter stuff into wiki and I could bring my expertise about a particular subject, and it would make it a lot easier because I could write about it and I'd know all the nuances about it, rather than handing it over to a volunteer to transcribe what I'd already written. But it was very clear quite soon after we started talking that there's a particular expertise required to enter it into wikis as well, isn't there?
Yeah, and that was actually possibly the world's first. I'm not going to claim that editathon, but before the word editathon had been invented. And so we have those now all over the world. Institutions host them and encourage them as part of their regular program of activities, just like you would have events for photographers, or you'd have events for local families, or any kind of community organisation or community group. The difference is that Wikipedians have a medium that they work in that has its own visitors. It's not merely an institution, a museum, working with an external organisation for its own sake, say the local primary school, for example. This is working with an organisation that you can also see benefit in its ongoing visibility of their work. So there's a win-win there, and that raises the antennae of the marketing department. And I say this from the perspective of someone who used to work in the marketing department at the National Library in Canberra. Then you stop thinking about the community value of working with and the curatorial value of working with this community to teach them about our collection, and you start thinking about the advertising value of people being aware of the institution. Now, I would love to see more museums consider their curators' time and their librarians and archivists' time working on the collection, sharing knowledge about the collection on fora that are not owned and controlled by that institution, or using copyright licenses that are designed to allow for people to reuse that content, which is certainly the case for the education teams of institutions. Education manager or education officer would go to a local high school and give a lecture to the students and staff, potentially, or take a museum in a box. Here's a variety of objects. We'll go to the local retirement home and do a kind of nostalgia tour through our collection, outreach events. And that's off-site and associated with the institution, but it's perfectly considered acceptable to do that, and a good use of time and money of staff to do that kind of outreach. It's the primary purpose of many institutions. Yet, doing that in a digital sense is in your own time, if you feel like it. You have to stay on brand. It's considered marketing. It's considered superfluous, which I think is a shame, since obviously there is a much larger potential audience in the digital world than there is in the physical world for that kind of outreach if done successfully.
Well, we've been very lucky where I am at the moment at the Parramatta Council, they've actually given us complete control of our own website, and we create all the content.
Very unlikely for a council.
I know, but I mean, they're a really good council, and the great thing is that it's meant that we've been able to put everything up with a Creative Commons license. And what we're finding is exactly what you're saying, that the content itself is there to be used. And what we're finding is just today I was doing some stats. We're finding that something like 70% of our inquiries are actually internal from council, about property developments, about DA, about all sorts of things, where they're looking at our historical content and archives for their own work. And before we did that, there was a presumption that it was all family history and people outside the institution using the services. So I absolutely agree. I think once you release that content and you may put it into a format that it's been checked, the copyrights are right, it reads okay. You can be fairly confident that the content is footnoted and referenced. Then you can do what you like with it, including putting them into the wikis. And it just seems crazy that people spend so much time trying to create product rather than stuff that can be put into a process. I don't know. Do you find that with institutions?
It actually makes me an analogy I think of is with broadcasters and BBC, ABC, for example. The archival collections of those institutions is massive, and they should be considered massive and massively important culturally. And I would like for those institutions, the ABC, the BBC, and so forth, to be considered as GLAMs, as the cultural sector, for their archival content. Arguably more socially relevant or culturally relevant than the content in the official archives of a nation, because it's content that has been designed for interaction and communication rather than merely the primary source documents of how a government operates. I don't want to make a ranking of importance, but we have huge collections of archival broadcast material that is kept entirely internally, poorly categorized, poorly archived, and poorly understood, poorly valued, I should say, by the institutions themselves as a cultural archive, and instead only considered to be a stock photography collection for future broadcasts and future material. And the proportion that is actually used for new material, for new broadcast, for new TV and radio is so low that it doesn't really justify the expense of keeping that material if that's the reason why you're keeping it. So here's all this stuff that's been collected and created and pushed out once to the world through TV and radio, and then kept because it's important or because we have to, but they're not really used either for internal purposes or for public reuse purposes. It's stymied in both senses, both on the basis of metadata and findability and on rights and sense of ownership and control.
Well, I think that's one of. We just had an example where we were getting a piece of footage from the National Film and Sound Archive, a very small piece of footage, and it was something like $3,400 to have this one piece of 30-second footage. Oh, it was actually a bit longer, it might have been a minute and a half. And it took 3 departments to negotiate to find the extra little bit of money that we would be okay to just bring that into the collections, to digitize ourselves and put it online and share it. You would have thought that would have been their mandate in the first place.
This is the misunderstanding or the misapplication, in my opinion, of open access directives, government open access directives that say, if you're a public institution, this is public material, then make it available, but also make money for yourselves. And institutions that have content often think, oh, okay, we're free access institutions. Anyone can come in and visit our stuff and ask our librarians to pull up material from the archive to to look at in our reading room for free, and that's our public service. But if you're online, then you have to pay for it, and you have to pay for it each time that you might want to use it, or the next time someone uses it. Even if the first person was paying a digitization fee, the second person who comes along, and I can perfectly just understand the justification for user pays work on a one-by-one basis for high technology and high touch interaction with the collection that requires digitization, for example, fine, or transcription. But the second person who comes along to request the same thing should not have to be charged the same fee. That's no longer a user pays for specific work of a professional. That's now double dip tax. It's already been paid by the public for creation, by some other member of the public for digitization, and now you're just being charged a fee for commercial reuse, even if you're not necessarily commercial. So it's
good to see the
freedom of digital community.
Yes, they did put it online.
Say again.
So it'd be good to, as you're saying, like, you know, once the fee's paid, it's almost like you're paying, whoever puts up the money is doing the public service for putting it online. The person that you're paying to digitize it should then be obliged to put it online, freely available for anybody else to use following that. Yeah, I mean, that would be you'd think the sensible way, so you're absolutely right.
Yeah, that's how you can, I would suggest, that's how you can morally justify a service fee for public collections. Hey, stick an exclusive period, you know, here we've digitized it for you, you paid us the money, we won't put it on our website for 6 months in order that you can go and sell your postcards or whatever. But because it's public collection and because we're a public institution, we will be putting it online. Thank you for your contribution to the public good.
It'd be kind of nice, wouldn't it, if maybe they could put a byline, you know, digitized by the institution that paid for it.
And this is the case with Trove, for example. With Trove newspapers, you can, I believe, on an annual basis, as in year by year, you can sponsor a newspaper. So you'll find that many individual newspapers visible in Trove, say, are digitized courtesy of the state library that they come from, and that's because that institution has put their own in-house funds towards that. Sometimes it's even the physical object in their collection, but sometimes it's a third party, like the Canberra Times, paid for itself. It said, we're going to let you digitize this material, and we're going to let you digitize and make available this material, but in the in-copyright period. Same also for the Australian Women's Weekly. That's available through past 1955 to the in-copyright period, but still a pre-digital period. That makes the Canberra Times and the Australian Women's Weekly the only contemporary sources that are fully digitized in Trove, at least as far as I'm aware. Making them, by definition, far more visible, more Googleable, more integrated into contemporary society, and more referenced in Wikipedia.
Okay. Well, I guess we got a little bit off track on the who the staff of the a lot about what the things are.
To answer the question about staff directly, I would suspect that many people would think I would say, oh no, the future of staff at museums is just sheep herders for volunteers, and who cares about expertise, and nothing's further from the truth. But what I would say is an analogy from a major cultural institution that I had previously worked with that has multiple divisions. This is an example of what an institution I think will increasingly focus on in terms of their promotions and their hiring strategies. Major international museum with 6 or 7 curatorial divisions, all of them geographic. The country that they're based in, Oceania, Africa, Asia, and so forth. One of those departments is subject, it's thematic. Let's call it philately, let's call it stamp collecting for the purposes of the analogy.
Mm-hmm.
All of the geographic departments hire people, their entry-level curatorial positions are for existing well-established PhDs in their field. It's a very important institution, so they get the top-notch people and promote on the basis of publication in that field of academic research. All good. The thematic institution, the thematic department, hires generalists. It hires clever people who do not necessarily know about stamp collecting. When it gets to the point of executive recruitment in that institution, the people who get hired disproportionately large number of times to the executive from the management of the individual departments is from the thematic part, because they're people who have life experience outside of the museum world or outside of even that particular subsection of the museum world. These are people who are good at management and good at public communication and good at being part of the society and have some external experience, not merely being really good at that particular thing. And being really good at that particular thing is important if you're going to be the curator of that thing. But even more important is the ability to communicate and interact with about that thing, I would suggest. And I think that's the metaphor I'd like to, or the analogy I'd like to draw across museum recruitment practices in general. I think that's where it's going to go.
Well, thanks very much for talking to us, Liam. It's been a pleasure. And maybe we'll, if you're up for it, we'll do another one in a little while.
Sure thing.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.